When the hair combs re-emerge, they look completely different in terms of their style, which is quite interesting and might suggest that either the hair types have changed or perhaps that the people that were making them were just making them in a completely different way. What we find is that they look completely different, so they don't look like traditional Afro combs anymore. I guess for intents and purposes they look closer to European style hair combs, and certainly the types of combs that you find in Greece and Rome much later than this period, but used by European cultures. The only difference is the teeth on the Egyptian hair combs in the New Kingdom are still set quite wide apart, which again suggests that the hair was coarse. If we fast forward in time, then we come to the next two hair combs. The first one dates to about 700 BC, so it's what we consider to be late period, and it was actually found in excavations at Saqqara, and it came to the museum in 1970s, and it was one of the last objects to actually come to the museum from Egypt. It's interesting because it shows a new design, and on one side we have still quite widely set apart teeth, but on the other side we have teeth that are much narrower. And what this suggests is perhaps that they had two different functions, or perhaps were for two different hair types. Much later still is the Roman comb, and this is around 2,000 years old, maybe slightly less. And this is interesting because what it does is it mimics the kind of hair combs that you find in Greece and Rome, so in Europe at a similar time. And it's interesting because the teeth are much narrower than any of the earlier combs that we find from Egypt. So this suggests that the hair types are starting to change, which would of course be natural when you have lots of Roman people moving to Egypt, marrying Egyptian people. And their children may have a different hair type to the much earlier ones than we had a look at a few minutes ago. The next two hair combs are very similar to one that we had a look at in the gallery, except they're less decorative. We're not 100% sure when they date to, but they're traditionally dated by comparing them to other examples to around 400 to 600 AD. So that makes them relatively modern when compared to some of the earlier examples that we've been having a look at. We've had one of them radiocarbon dated, so we should get a much firmer idea of when they date to very shortly. They're interesting because, like the late period comb and also the Roman comb, they have two different sides. One side has still quite wide teeth, and on the other side they're incredibly narrow. It's been suggested that some of these hair combs were used to comb lice out of the hair. It's also possible that they were used as part of the styling. What's also interesting about these hair combs is that they don't have animal decoration on them, and that would accord with the idea that they're much later, because of course the religion had changed to Christianity and then to Islam. And what we have is a series of combs that are decorated with just geometric patterns, as you can see here. And again, this may be an influence of the culture as well as changing hair types and hairstyles. So all of these different aspects may contribute to a completely different hair comb re-emerging in the form of the Afro. So what we're trying to do as part of the project is to look at links between different African cultures over, of course, geographical region, but also across time. One quite remarkable similarity that we don't know and can't say whether it was directly linked or not, but whether or not I think it's still of considerable interest, is the similarity between a rather peculiar and distinctive crown that ancient Egyptian kings wore called the blue crown. Now you can see here that Ramesses II, and this is an image of a statue in Turin in the Egyptian Museum, is wearing the blue crown. And if you have a look closer, you can see that there are tiny depictions of concentric circles on the crown. Now, a different period, but still this region of Africa, in the Meroitic period in Sudan, when you see this type of depiction, it normally represents Afro hair on the Meroitic Sudanese rulers, about the period of about 200 AD. What's remarkable is that in the 1950s, the photograph on the right-hand side was taken, and this shows a member of the Watutsi people, and the hairstyle is incredibly like the form of the blue crown. Now, as I said, we can't make a direct link between the two, but nevertheless I think this particular instance and the similarity between the two styles is quite remarkable. Another hairstyle that we find commonly in lots and lots of different African cultures across time is the side lock, and this was associated with young people, particularly boys. On the right hand side you can see an image of a young boy with his mother, and in fact the mother's actually wearing her hair styled in the Hathor hairstyle, and she's holding on to her son protectively. And on the left hand side you can see an archive photograph from Namibia, and it shows a young boy with a side lock. Now what would happen at the time of puberty is the side lock would actually be cut off, or in some cases would be incorporated into a different hairstyle. So what this symbolises is the side lock of youth, and it's something that we find for thousands of years in Africa. William Matthew Flinders Petrie was one of the earliest people to actually take any notice of hair combs, and it's a bit strange really because ancient Egyptian hair combs have received relatively little attention compared to other types of objects. What was interesting about Petrie's work was that he tried to put the hair combs into a typology or a sequence, and as a consequence of that he made an attempt to date them. The very early hair combs, as you can see here from this plate from one of his publications on the pre-dynastic period, shows hair combs that are similar to the example that we've had a look at already with the double bird motif. And you can see lots of all different sorts of animals appearing, mainly birds but also some quadrupeds. You can see lots of hair combs like the later examples at the Fitzwilliam Museum that were actually catalogued and looked at by Flinders Petrie, and these form part of the last sequence of his hair combs. So it was actually Petrie who suggested that they dated to around 400 to 600 AD, and it's that we're going to find out when we get the radiocarbon test back. Archive photographs are really useful because of course we don't have ancient Egyptians around to ask them how they used the hair combs that they produced. What we can see on this example is that the woman's using a traditional Afro comb to hold back the hair while she styles it by plaiting or braiding the hair with a much narrower comb that's more typical of a European comb. So it's interesting to see the two combs in action, and I think perhaps that we might find when we look in more detail in some of the different types of hair comb that appear in ancient Egypt is that some of them may have been manufactured at the same time. Not necessarily indicating different hair types, although that's possible, but it's possible that they were used for different functions in the same way that people use combs today.